Welcome to ICN Sunday Morning. I'm Vernon Loeb, Executive Editor. Last week, environmentalists celebrated a small victory when Utah Senator Mike Lee agreed to remove a provision he'd inserted into the Trump administration's Big Beautiful Bill that would have mandated the sale of 2 to 3 million acres of public lands. His move came only after the Senate parliamentarian ruled that the provision dealt with policy and not strictly budgeting. But at the very same time, Trump's agriculture secretary, Brooke Rollins, appeared before the Western Governors Association in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and announced that the administration would rescind the so-called Roadless rule, which since 2001 has protected 58 million acres of the nation's most pristine public wilderness from road construction and timber harvesting by the Forest Service. So, make no mistake, the Trump administration's war over public lands is on. This morning, I'm joined by Wyatt Myskow, our Phoenix-based reporter who logs a lot of miles out west covering public lands, mining, and water policy in the Colorado River Basin states. Wyatt, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Vernon.
So was this quest to open up and maybe sell off public lands something you saw coming, or was this move by Mike Lee and then the announcement by Brooke Rollins was sort of more of a surprise assault?
This is not a surprise for me. Starting with Project 2025, when President Trump was seeking re-election for his second term, it was clear in those documents that they intended to roll back protections for federal lands, both at the Bureau of Land Management and at the Forest Service, but also that there was interest in developing housing on public lands. And this goes back to kind of a long-standing vocal minority in the Republican Party to privatize public lands and turn over federal lands to states, kind of a mix of both. And Senator Mike Lee has been a longtime advocate for this. Again, it's kind of a vocal minority. Many Republicans do not support this, as we've seen with these proposals in recent months from the Trump administration and from Senator Lee. But some folks have wanted this. And on the surface, it somewhat makes sense. You have federal agencies based in D.C. that are managing federal lands, across the country and, often remote places far away from D.C. But the reality obviously looks very different. Because these lands are kind of, the idea of them is managing them for the good of all Americans. That includes corporations, but it also includes individuals like you and me. And so it's kind of been this long simmering tension that's kind of finally really blowing up in the open now.
In your piece about the Western Governors Conference in Santa Fe, where Rollins made her announcement, you also wrote that Doug Bergam, Trump's Interior Secretary, referred to public lands as a balance sheet. And further, you wrote that Bergam believes that climate change will be solved in just a decade or two. So how does he get there? What is he talking about when he says that?
Yeah, there were lots of interesting things said in that keynote speech at that conference. But you noted that climate change being solved in the next decade or two. And that one really struck my attention, and I think maybe some others, because I don't think you'll find many climate scientists who agree with that. But what he was referring to in that was that this administration is making lots of efforts, one, to boost American energy, and two, to develop AI as quickly as possible. And essentially what he was saying there was that, right before that, he mentioned rolling back regulations for nuclear, and also establishing things to boost nuclear and uranium in this country, mining for uranium, and then refining that uranium into the fuel needed for nuclear power plants. And that that is clean energy. Obviously, there's environmental consequences of that potentially, but that would be clean energy and would be able to support both kind of the standard of living Americans want and need, but also power these data centers and this AI that could help solve these questions. Obviously very optimistic. I'm not sure everyone would agree with that, but it was somewhat interesting to hear someone that high in the administration kind of acknowledging climate change and that they are working to solve it, but in a way that's obviously very different than what something the Biden administration would have said, or what maybe some top climate scientists would argue. For those listening, our audience, some colleagues and I are working on a project about nuclear and uranium and this kind of renewed interest in bringing it back in the U.S. And obviously, there's potential there in terms of expanding nuclear power, but it's not as simple as just flipping a switch and suddenly we have a ton of nuclear. You have to find the minerals for it. You have to extract those, and that comes at often a cost to local communities. And the country currently doesn't really have the capacity to refine and turn that into the fuel needed to actually be a nuclear power plant. So there's a lot of questions that still need to be answered before that happens. And I'm not sure if it's really doable in 10 or 20 years. But that certainly is not going to stop this administration from trying.
Yeah. So in the debate over public lands, Lee argues that his provision, now rescinded provision, but he argued that it would really only affect 2 to 3 million acres of land over the next 5 years. On the other hand, the Wilderness Society said that it would have potentially made 258 million acres of public lands, forests, and other lands susceptible to development in 11 Western states. So what are the stakes here in this debate over what to do and how to manage public lands?
Yeah, so that initial proposal from Lee that was tucked into the mega bill, it mandated the BLM to sell that 2 to 3 million acres of land, both on BLM and Forest Service land. But it would have been out of a pool of that roughly 250 million acres would be available. So essentially, you had 250 million acres that were available, and essentially, developers would be able to come in, pick, and say, hey, this is what we want, and then those lands would be auctioned off. So not that entire 250 million would be sold off, but anything within that 250 million would be susceptible. And obviously, there was some land that would maybe make sense to develop housing on, but there was also some land that were really, just far away from any communities that might actually need housing, and two, in very, just beautiful stretches of public lands that are popular tourist spots, recreational areas, obviously, also conservation areas that would have been made potentially available. And a big fear from a lot of groups was that, those type of lands would really attract those, the idea of these kind of gated, exclusive communities right next to these very scenic landmarks, right? And that they would, sure, there'd be housing might be built there, but it would not be affordable, as is, was the stated goal of this bill. As you mentioned, that initial proposal is now out of the bill, been thrown out, but Mike Lee has proposed a scaled back version of it. This one it gets rid of selling off any Forest Service land. It would just sell off land managed by the Bureau of Land Management, and they would be required to dispose of 0.25% to 0.05% of their land. And it also would require that land to be within 5 miles, quote, border of a population center to be eligible. So that kind of get rid of a ton of the land that would be much further out. That was the real big concern for many groups. And so in total, that would require the BLM to sell somewhere between 600,000 to 1.2 million acres in those 11 Western states. So still a lot of land, but less than half what was initially proposed. I think environmental groups are, obviously thrilled that the initial bill is gone. They're still concerned that this amendment might be able to still pass through the Senate and get put into law. And the fear there, of course, is what comes next. Once you start selling off federal land for housing, it becomes much more palatable to say in a year or two, you pass legislation to do similar things for mining or for the fossil fuel industry or other types of developments. And the concern there, I guess, is really just a slippery slope. As of right now, as we speak, this new proposal has not made it into the bill yet. We'll just have to wait and see what happens. But certainly the attempt to sell off lands in this mega bill remains.
Yeah, if the new provision is 5 miles away from population centers, that would seem to sort of rule out its facility for public housing, which Lee has mentioned as a rationale. Yeah. Environmentalists and lots of others have said, look, this land really makes no sense for public housing, quite frankly, which is needed in the cities and not out in the wilderness. So if not public housing, why do some Republicans, lots of Republicans actually, including the president, want to sell this land or want to lease this land? What are the uses they envision?
Yeah, well, for many, many have touted, housing, as they've said. Senator Lee has long proposed doing this. There's actually, a good example that I've written about. It was the first time I wrote about it. It was one of the first stories I did at Inside Climate News, was about land being sold off in Las Vegas, federal land, to pave the way for more housing. The argument was the same there. There's a ton of federal land. We don't have enough land within the city. We need to do this. And it's true that, if you sold off this land, especially when it's close to these, urban centers, that yes, that would pave the way for new housing. But what we saw at the time there in this proposal outside of Las Vegas, one, it just led to continued sprawling single-family homes, which one typically aren't the most affordable. They're not built, and there aren't actual affordable housing requirements tied into any of this legislation. So, yes, more housing will be built, and most experts will tell you that yes, more housing is better than no housing, but it's not actually doing anything to adjust that actually for affordable housing. And two, the big concern from a lot of environmental groups was that one, you're as you're building these more subdivisions and essentially new cities in some cases, not only are you taking away good habitat for species for conservation purposes, but also recreational areas. But also that's just fueling kind of this unsustainable growth that a lot of Western communities have, which is where most of this would happen because most of our federal land is located on the western half of the country. You're building into the urban wildland interface, making communities more susceptible to wildfires. You're building more sprawling homes and not building up. Those are less efficient, also more expensive. There's just a lot of concerns there, and that was the case then, and it remains the case here.
Yeah. Back to the roadless rule. So this is a rule that prohibits building roads in really our most pristine forests, 58 million acres. One of the justifications the Trump administration has used for rescinding this rule is wildfire protection. But would building roads through forests do anything to stop or cut down on wildfires?
That's a really great question. And this morning, actually, the Wilderness Society put out some results of findings they had from a study they've just recently have completed, and it is now in the peer review process. This is not a new issue. This rule has been somewhat controversial for many years, and this topic has come up before. And so they started the study quite some time ago before, this week's announcement that this administration will be attempting to rescind that rule. And what they found is that land near roads, more wildfires start near roads. And that's because there's more human activity. Cars are driving around, maybe sparks fly up, someone, tosses a cigarette butt out their window, someone camps near there because there's a road nearby, so it's more accessible. And their campfire, they don't extinguish it properly, and it leads to a fire. So I spoke to one of the scientists this morning, actually, and he said, to quote him, "You're creating a problem to solve a problem," to sum up what this attempt would do. Yes, if you build more roads, that makes it easier for, fire personnel to get to those fires, but you're also creating more fires because a lot more fires happen on these roads or near these roads than they do. And in the chart, it's kind of shocking to see, the amount of fires in wilderness areas, like these roadless areas, are, this big, and, the ones that are near roads are, triple in size. And that's this was looking at across all Forest Service land across the country. It was true across regions, both the Southwest, the Mountain West, even on the East Coast. If it's near a road, it's more likely to have fires. The one small caveat to that is that in those more remote areas, the fires do tend to get bigger because one, there's less, fire personnel to respond to them because they can't oftentimes. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. A lot of science has shown that, really part of our fire problem is because we've suppressed so many fires over the past century and not let some of these fires, take out some of this old growth and allow, younger trees to come in, clear out some of that vegetation, all of that. But also those areas, these roadless areas are remote. They're roadless. No one's really living out there. So the Forest Service often has not had an incentive to go and suppress those fires because one of their policies is, hey, these fires actually can be sometimes beneficial. We should let them burn. And two, it's just not feasible to go get them. There's other fires happening that are near actual communities where people live or, infrastructure that matters. We're going to take care of those before we go take care of this fire in the middle of nowhere. And so, it's one of those things where it's, yes, this could help, but really it's probably going to create more problems than it actually solves. I think really the rationale behind this is that it paves the way for more development. It allows loggers to now build roads. I mean, part of the roadless rule is also it stopped logging from happening. You can't build a road and you can't get in there and log any of this. And if you start building roads, that opens up the door, of course, to logging, but also potentially other types of development. You can apply to, mine on Forest Service land, to drill on Forest Service land. Those things can also happen. And so I think really at the end of the day, it's less about trying to stop wildfires and more about assisting industry, which is really, I think, a lot of what the Trump administration's policies over these first 6 months have really been about, more so than providing more housing or preventing wildfires.
Yeah. And so what actually has to take place before the roadless rule gets rescinded? I think I've read somewhere where Earth Justice is already saying, we're going to court if they really try to rescind this. So where does this process go from here?
Yeah, well, I'll start with what happens next. There's a few ways to rescind a rule. There's two options that are most likely going to happen. One, President Trump could sign an executive order rescinding the rule. And of course, he could be sued for that, as he has been sued for many of his executive orders so far this administration. And second would be that the Forest Service begins a formal rulemaking process to rescind the rule. And that would be, putting out in the Federal Register, open to the public, what they are proposing, seeking out public comment from, locals, environmental groups, experts, state agencies, really anyone who has a stake in this, to submit their public comments and thoughts. And from there, the Forest Service, analyzes it, crafts a proposal, and then submits it again. Typically, it's would be a more long-term process, maybe slightly less likely for litigation, but I think ultimately groups like Earth Justice and other environmental groups would probably still sue because they don't want to see this go. It protects millions of acres of land from development, and obviously they'll sue no matter what. And I think, yeah, it's incredibly likely that groups will sue. I mean, as you mentioned, groups have already signaled they will, and I mean, this is just a huge stake of land. Lawsuits are already happening over smaller rules being rescinded, rules that hadn't even really taken effect yet that the Biden administration had put in for conservation purposes and restricting oil and gas development on public lands. I can only imagine a rule that would essentially open up over 50 million acres of land for development will be sued over if it is actually rescinded.
Yeah. So where do we go from here in this partisan debate over public lands and public land management? I think we're already seeing something of a divide within the Republican Party over the issue. I think both of Utah Republican senators and both of Montana's Republican senators have said, wait a minute, we're not for the wholesale sale of public lands. There's no doubt Trump seems to be behind it. Brooke Rollins is touting the roadless rule rescission. So what's going to happen from here going forward?
I think we'll continue to see the Republican Party split over this. As I've said, this has always been a vocal minority that's wanted to essentially get rid of federal land and turn it over to private/state hands. And that voice has kind of grown because they found a home in, President Trump's kind of coalition. But there are still, as you mentioned, many Republicans who are not for this. For example, in this proposal that Lee has proposed, it's 11 Western states, and it excludes Montana because Montana's congressional delegation has fought this as hard as they can. It includes a former Interior Secretary under the first Trump administration, Rep. Ryan Zinke, who, many environmentalists will tell you were not big fans of the guy when he was in the first Trump administration, but he has refused to tolerate any proposed land sales, especially in Montana. And he was the key reason that a House version of this bill was killed when the House passed their version of the Mecow bill. I think we're going to continue to see that. It'll be interesting to see how states like Utah, Colorado, Arizona, that have these, bigger coalitions, larger states with more people kind of respond. And I think there's still a question over, even if this does get stripped from the mega bill, this does not stop anything. The Interior Department and the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, are collaborating with a joint task force to figure out what federal lands will be suitable for residential development. So there are other paths outside of Congress that we may see these types of actions occur. And environmental groups are going to be fighting them no matter what, tooth and neck, frankly. And also some representatives, both Democrats for sure, but also even some Republicans like Representative Zinke, which, again, might be a surprise to some folks. But one thing I think people need to keep in mind is that public lands are enjoyed by Americans of all stripes. Polling shows that, they're incredibly popular. People support national monuments, they support national parks, and they support public lands just broadly, just being there for recreational purposes. And one of the big reasons why, Senator Lee has rolled back his proposal is that the hunting coalitions, who are not typically the most liberal or left-of-thinking folks, have pushed hard against this because many hunters hunt on public land. I grew up hunting, and we hunted on public land because it was cheaper, it was easier to access, it had lots of benefits versus, otherwise you have to go find some rancher or some private company, pay them a few $1,000s so you can hunt on their land. Most people don't want to do that, especially when you have an option that's free. So there's a lot of people writing against this, and I think we'll continue to see a lot of discussion and a lot of debate over this in the coming months and likely years to come.
Yeah. Wyatt, thanks so much for joining me. Your reporting is great, and keep up the good work.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. And thanks to all of you for watching, for reading, and for supporting our work at Inside Climate News.